a trade and tourism delegation to Japan and Singapore. These countries are our fourth and fifth largest trading partners, respectively, representing nearly $15 billion worth of two-way trade. Reconnecting with the world and sending the message that New Zealand is open for business is a key component of our economic rebuild. Our exports of goods and services and the resumption of tourism is critical to that. In fact, our goods exports have played an important role in sustaining our economy over the last 2 years and are now at levels 5.7% higher than pre-COVID. The return of tourists from Australia last week, alongside the move to Orange, saw a bumper Easter weekend of economic activity across the country, and I know many hospitality and tourism operators sorely needed this, and I hope it continues. The further reopening of the border on May the 2nd to visa waiver countries will add to the suite of initiatives that the government has been actively supporting over the last 2 years to grow the economy. And while there are challenges facing Kiwi households right now, it is important to note that despite the worst economic shock in over 100 years, we have ensured the New Zealand economy grew by 5.6% to year-end 2021, and that we currently have a low unemployment rate of 3.2%. As part of our economic approach, we have been addressing long-term infrastructure deficits and creating jobs at the same time, and this has been supported by the RMA fast-track consenting process that was established in 2020 after the first lockdown. Today, with 3 new projects having been approved, we reached the milestone of 50 projects having gone through this process, 17 of which have now also obtained consent from an expert panel. The 3 new projects today are New Zealand Wind Farm's Te Rere Hau Wind Farm Repowering Project, the Waimari Street Residential Development in St Heliers, Auckland, and the Flint Park West project in the Lake Hayes area near Queenstown. The Te Rere Hau Wind Farm project will redevelop and expand the existing wind farm in the Tararua Range southeast of Palmerston North. The project involves removing 97 existing 2-blade turbines and installing 30 new 3-blade turbines, creating 197 jobs. The Waimari Street Residential Development Project in St Heliers, Auckland will create approximately 58 residential units in predominantly terraced houses between 2 and 3 stories high, and this project is expected to create 212 jobs. And the Flint Park West project is a medium-density housing development in the Lake Hayes area that will construct approximately 315 residential units and create 617 jobs. To date, the 50 projects referred for approval cover 13 of New Zealand's 16 regions, and together they have the potential to create more than 18,000 jobs and build 8,772 houses. These projects have been consented faster, on average 15 months sooner per project, meaning that these jobs will come online sooner. The boom in house construction, combined with our apprenticeship boost initiative, is driving up the number of skilled New Zealanders available to work on these projects. The Building and Construction Industry Training Organisation says that by the end of March it had 21,600 apprentices, 77% more than at the same time in 2020. Growing our economy and creating jobs while keeping a lid on debt are the core components of our plan to rebuild from COVID. They will sustain our recovery through the current inflationary pressures and mean that we are well positioned to come out the other side with people in work and gaps in our infrastructure deficit filled. Happy to take your questions.
Are you going to have to rein in spending to stop out of control cost of living?
Well, I think it's really important still to note that the big drivers of cost of living pressures are ones that are generated offshore. So in particular, COVID-19 pandemic and the pressure that that's put on supply chains. Obviously, we've got the war in Ukraine now that is putting further pressure on that. And so while we have to be careful with our spending, we've got to continue to be balanced in the way that we approach our government spending. It is important that we don't cut our nose off to spite our face and take away funding that's really important in areas like health or education or housing.
You pulled back on any of your budget initiatives to stop so much impact hitting households?
Well, as I say, we're not going to reduce the price of food at the supermarket by cutting health spending. We have to look carefully at all of our initiatives to make sure that they're value for money and that they're doing the things that New Zealanders would expect us to do. But in this budget, for example, we are completely rebuilding New Zealand's health system. There is a one-off component to the operating allowance which is for that purpose. Other than that, the operating allowance is similar to levels that we've seen recently. But the job of making sure that we carefully balance our spending is one I take seriously. I know that the job of making sure that monetary policy plays its role is one that the Governor of the Reserve Bank takes seriously.
He has basically sounded alarm bells to the International Monetary Fund today, saying he needs your help with the fiscal side of things. What do you think?
I think he made those comments in the context of all central banks around the world. And I agree with him that we've got to make sure that our spending is targeted and make sure that it goes to the right places. It's the reason why we've focused our cost of living attention on those on low and middle incomes with our 1 April package and with the winter energy payment coming back in on the 1st of May, rather than untargeted tax cuts that benefit people who earn more than $180,000 a year, as the National Party would have it.
Minister, is this current budget going to tighten fiscal policy or loosen it?
Well, as I've indicated, we will be setting new fiscal rules because the last couple of years has obviously seen us needing to suspend some of the targets that we've previously had. I'm also on the record as saying that I think it's really important that we use fiscal policy sensibly to be able to make sure New Zealand not only keeps a lid on our debt, but also make sure that we invest in the right things such as infrastructure long term. And so I'll have more to say about all of that before the budget and on budget day itself.
So is it going to tighten it or loosen it?
Well, as I said, I'll have more to say about that on budget day. We will continue to keep a lid on debt. It is important for New Zealand that our debt levels return down from where they are now. We were well served by having relatively low debt as we came in to a crisis like COVID-19. But I also have to balance that against the fact that New Zealand has a massive infrastructure deficit, which we will continue to invest in.
The December half-yearly actually shows the government withdrawing fiscal stimulus from the economy.
Indeed, I presume you're referring to the fiscal impulse, and indeed, because a lot of the support that we put in place for COVID is temporary, and this comes to Jenna's earlier line of questioning, which is we are moving away from that cross-the-board support fiscally that we provided. The largest part of what we did was things like the wage subsidy scheme, the resurgent support payment. Those are no longer available, and we're moving to much more targeted cost of living style support, such as you saw on the 1st of April and with the winter energy payment. So yes, it is true that some of that large scale fiscal spending is going. The point I'm making is that there are long-term investments that New Zealand needs to make in areas like infrastructure. Thomas.
Well,
I was actually going to ask Bennett's question.
We'll go Janae
on inflation, are you A, looking at further ways of actually curbing inflation, and B, looking at ways of easing the pain of inflation?
In terms of fiscal policy, as I said, we will continue to operate a carefully balanced policy. There are areas of investment in New Zealand society that we need to continue with, the building of state houses, for example. There are areas such as the health system where I think COVID-19 has shown New Zealanders the importance of the kind of reforms that we're proposing, and I believe we need to carry on with those. But every decision we make at the budget is based on whether we get value for money and how we can best make sure that New Zealanders benefit. In terms of the impacts of inflation, we've obviously seen that significant 1 April package, and we have the 1 May start of the winter energy payment. We'll always continue to look to see if there are other ways, but there are other things that are currently planned.
So is just to confirm, the Reserve Bank is out on its own in terms of getting on top of inflation, which admittedly is its job. You're not going to help out because you are just charging ahead with the agenda that you've set out and you've been working towards for some time.
Well, what I'd say is that we will always continue to carefully look at our expenditure and make sure that New Zealanders are getting value for money from that. But as I said earlier on, we've got a housing crisis. We've all acknowledged that. Could the government decide to stop building state houses? Well, yes, we could, but that would be cutting our nose off to spite our face. We need to make these long-term investments. So we will continue carefully balancing our program. The Governor of the Reserve Bank and the Monetary Policy Committee are not on their own. Fiscal and monetary policy do work together, but as you rightly point out, it is the core mandate of the Reserve Bank to keep inflation between 1% and 3% over the medium term. They take that job seriously, and we can all see what they're doing in that regard.
There are limited tools to be. I mean, the effectiveness of the OCR is fairly limited in this environment, given where some of the inflation is coming from, and also given that the mountain of mortgage debt that households have. Arguably, the Reserve Bank cannot crank up the OCR too much So does that put the focus back on the government and what it can do?
It's always a balancing act for both monetary and fiscal policy, and in fact in the comments that were mentioned earlier that the Reserve Bank Governor made, he acknowledged that balancing act that is there for monetary policy. The same balancing act exists for fiscal policy, and so we'll continue to do our bit, make sure that we're spending wisely and carefully. There are a number of things that we can continue to do, such as the work we're doing with supermarkets around how we can control the price of food, and I think it is important to note that the government's response to the Commerce Commission report is due shortly, and you've heard Dr Clark in recent weeks say that if we don't get the results that we're looking for, we are prepared to go further there. So there are things that we can do that are not just spending related, they're also regulatory related. But I just reiterate, government spending on the health system is important. If we were to cut that, we would not reduce the cost of food that people are paying or the cost of fuel. We cut the fuel excise duty by 25 cents. We've reduced road user charges. That will have a dampening effect on the inflation numbers that we see later this week. Ben, I said Ben.
Do you and the Prime Minister need a sort of sharper answer on that question? Because you've been peppered it for a month. Do you think Kiwis blame you for inflation?
No, I don't. I think New Zealanders understand that this is a global phenomenon. They only need to see the headlines every night where we hear that inflation in the US has gone over 8%. Inflation in the UK has gone over 7%. They can see the war in Ukraine. They've heard about the supply chain constraints. They know them themselves because they've ordered goods that aren't arriving as quickly because ships aren't coming to New Zealand as quickly. So I'm not surprised people are concerned, Ben, about the cost of living because it really is affecting people. What we know is that the government will always has to be careful with the way it spends money on behalf of New Zealanders. But these international factors, these global factors, are what is driving inflation.
And on that, is the time right to continue with the income insurance scheme, or would that be an extra cost that businesses and employees can't afford at the moment?
So the income insurance scheme is not designed to come into force until the end of 2023 at the earliest. So doing the design work now is not going to cause the issues that you're alluding to. And again, that's an example of a lesson learned from COVID, where we didn't have a scheme of that nature and we had to create ad hoc schemes to support it. So doing the design work now is important, but there are no costs being imposed on anybody until at least the end of 2023.
Are you open to delaying the introduction of the
No, that's more about just how long it'll take to design it.
I think you just did say fiscal and monetary policy need to work together. And during the loosening cycle that you worked together on stuff like house prices and the LSAT in terms of signing off the indemnity, how does that look like during the tightening cycle? How do fiscal and monetary policy help each other and talk to each other when we're in the condition that we're currently in?
Yeah, well, as we've noted, the Reserve Bank has its tool with the OCR, which it uses, and that is its tightening tool. Obviously, they also look at the way in which they work with banks and the macroprudential tools that they have available to them there as well. From our point of view, we do, and I'm repeating myself, I acknowledge, we do our job of making sure that the money that we're spending is value for money. But I do challenge those opposition politicians, in particular the National Party, who actually over the last few weeks have said they would spend exactly the same amount as we would, just in a slightly different and less targeted way. And so actually fiscal policy in New Zealand will continue, I think, to play an important role in supporting us in those long-term endeavours.
Just to be clear on the Governor's remarks today around targeted fiscal spending, you interpreted those to be general remarks about general central banks everywhere rather than specific.
I think if you look at the governor's comments, they are to the IMF. They are speaking about central banks, which is a pretty clear indication that he's talking globally, given that we don't call ourselves a central, or the Reserve Bank doesn't call itself a central bank here. So yeah, I think those comments are set in the context globally of the pressures of COVID-19 and the pressures of inflation. I don't, however, reject the point that the Governor's making, that every government needs to be focused on making sure we have value for money spending, and that we do that in such a way that doesn't exacerbate the issues.
Made those remarks directly in the future. There'll be future MPS press conferences. He will be asked that question, and if he does direct it a bit more directly at you, what would your response be?
Awful lot of ifs in that question, Thomas. Anna.
It's not
Just
in a
on
good place though.
supermarkets, last week we saw stats showing that a quarter of Māori children and 37% of Pacifican children live in homes where their food runs out, alongside a 7.8% rise in food prices. I mean, it's great that a report's coming for them, but when can they expect to see affordable food prices?
Yeah, look, we want to make sure that food prices are more affordable for all New Zealanders, and that is the point of the work we've done around the Commerce Commission. What we have, however, done for low and middle income families is boost their incomes to help them meet those costs. So that 1st of April package was heavily targeted to those in receipt of income support, those getting family tax credits, those on student allowances. That's where we can do our bit now to support people with those cost of living pressures. And then on the 1st of May, the winter energy payment arrives for superannuitants and for those who are on receipt of income support. In addition, through the COVID-19 period, we've put significant resources into food security, so supporting not only food banks but also community organisations who have been out there delivering that food directly to those households. We continue to do that today through a number of different NGOs and also through the Care in the Community program that operates for people who have to isolate with COVID-19. So we certainly recognise those pressures. We're looking at the long-term solutions but also at the short-term ways of lifting income.
Will a decision be made
Sorry,
about...
Nathan, go.
Just for them, how long does it generally take from for the government, if it wants to go further on these recommendations, to actually seeing a difference in prices at the supermarket? Will it be this year, next year, the year after?
Yeah, look, and it will take some time. I absolutely acknowledge that around the Commerce Commission. There are some more immediate things that the Commerce Commission has recommended, particularly around things like voluntary codes and so on, but some of the more dramatic actions that they in the end did not put in their recommendations, such as separation of some of the entities involved, we're still considering further. So at this time, yes, it will take a year perhaps, maybe slightly longer. In the interim, however, what we're doing is making sure that it is affordable. Also, in terms of lifting people's incomes, also what I would say is that while inflation has spiked up and it is projected to continue to rise perhaps into the second quarter of this year, it is then expected to come down again after that. And so this is a difficult time for many families, and that's why we're supporting them. We'll come to Luke.
One of the design features of having an independent central bank is that inflation, you're in control of your own inflation destiny. So regardless of what's happening. So at what point at which most bank economists are expecting around 7% inflation on Thursday to be confirmed, at what point do you start to ask some harder questions of the bank about their management of inflation? How long will it have to be at elevated levels, or what level would it have to be at for you to say, hang on guys, what's going on?
I think the first part of your question indicates where I have to come from, and this answer is that they are independent. The mandate that we set them is to reach that 1 to 3% over the medium term. That is their view, that they will do that over the next couple of years. They obviously have a job to do, and you saw when they made the change last week that they are committed to the cycle of tightening that they've indicated. So they are doing the thing, using the tool that they have to do the thing that they are asked to do. What this then comes down to is a philosophical discussion about what the medium term is, which is one that's been debated for many, many years since that change was made. But I think you can see by the actions that the Reserve Bank is taking and the direction of travel that they've pointed to that they recognise that this is their job.
When will the decision be made about letting cruise ships back into New Zealand?
As soon as possible. As I indicated to media this morning, Cabinet's awaiting some further advice from the Ministry of Health to finalise our position there. My understanding is that there would be no intention for any cruise ships to come to New Zealand until at least October, and I'm sure we will have things well and truly sorted out before then.
Health concerns are there around having cruise ships back, and are you worried about cruise ship clusters again?
Yeah, I think we're all aware of the role that cruise ships played in the early days of the pandemic, and there's still a concern that they operate in slightly different ways than the air travel and the air border does. But don't get me wrong, we want to see cruise ships back in New Zealand. I'm confident that will happen, but we have to make sure we get the right advice and make that decision in the right way.
Cabinet still sticking to that October date, because there was some suggestion you might be able to bring that forward?
Well, that's more the date that we have been told that there would be cruise ships wanting to come by. As we've indicated more generally, we're looking to try and bring forward decisions around the border as we've done with the air border. So I'd expect an announcement around that within the next couple of weeks.
Well,
But
just
it's
a,
on the
Turn it
Reserve
and then
Bank.
we'll come back to Janae.
one part of the Reserve Bank actions that you do get a say in, or jointly sign off on, is the funding for lending program, which the Reserve Bank lends billions to banks at very low interest rates, the OCR, that is still open and being used and is up from 6 billion to banks.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognise what my role in that is, which is that at the beginning, at the front end, we had that discussion around what it would look like, and I indicated to the Reserve Bank my views on how that should be focused, which is all out there now. But the actual implementation of it and how it is allocated is obviously up to them. I'm sure the Governor is, and you could certainly put the question to him, is aware of the role that it plays, and if he's looking at the broader tightening, that may be an area he chooses to look at. Janae.
From July, Treasury will start monitoring the Reserve Bank under changes made to the Reserve Bank Act. Two things. Will we see, in terms of policy outcomes, will we see changes as members of the public? And secondly, will you use that change to, to do anything differently in terms of your oversight of the bank?
It's a monitoring role, and it's a role created as a result of the legislative changes that we've made. It's not a role to alter the policy settings per se. It's a role to make sure that those policy settings are being followed. So I expect that I'll be getting regular updates and advice from the Treasury, as I actually already do, but now in a more formal way, around the way in which the bank does the job that we've set it, but it's not about changing the policy, no.
Will this see you have more meetings with the board to sort of just check on how things are going?
I meet reasonably regularly with the chair of the board of the Reserve Bank. The board itself, of course, is changing under the new legislation. It has a slightly wider role, a more traditional board role, for want of a better way of phrasing it, and so they'll have a job to do. The Reserve Bank has a job to monitor all of them, but I expect to continue to meet with the chair on a regular basis.
I just wanted to know if the government was intending to pursue the extradition of Mr. Kim to China.
I'm sorry, I don't have any information on that at all, but I will be able to follow it up for you.
ASB is predicting another hike to the OCR of 50 basis points. How concerned are you about people's ability to pay their mortgage if that continues?
Well, the Reserve Bank's laid out the track that it's on, and as the Governor indicated when the Monetary Policy Committee made their announcement last week, in many ways they brought forward rather than extend it out. So this is something that people will be able to see in the future. There is no doubt some people who will experience mortgage stress. I'm among a number of people who've said over the last few years that people need to think about when they're borrowing that they won't necessarily be paying it back at the rate that they initially borrowed it. But yes, there will be some will be there. Obviously, how that plays out really depends on individual household circumstances. So in some cases, it means that their discretionary spending will be reduced. In extreme cases, it can lead to people having to sell their homes, but that's not what the studies that you've seen recently have indicated. That's more in the end of the stress end than the other end of it.
Is it fair? Like, you've got a whole bunch of first home buyers that bought at the peak of the market last year, mortgaged up to their eyeballs, and now they're...
Look, it's a challenging situation for some households. We have this system. We've just been debating inflation. We have a tool that the Reserve Bank uses to be able to manage that through the OCR. That has an impact on mortgage interest rates. It is the way that the system works, and this is the part of the cycle that we're in now. We have seen the playing field tilt towards first-home buyers somewhat because of the policy changes we've made. But obviously for those who did borrow, they are going to have to carefully manage money over the next period.
The problem in you relying only on the OCR, what are you going to do?
Well, we've done an awful lot to make sure that more houses are being built, and we've got a record number of consents in New Zealand, and we are seeing house building start to have an impact in our cities to ensure that supply actually does meet demand. We continue to provide support for New Zealanders to be able to, go about their business, be it through working for families or be it through the accommodation supplement and so on. So there are a number of levels of support, but unfortunately, when interest rates rise like this, if people have their mortgages with the bank, which they do, then they will be paying whatever the bank charges them. Sorry, I'll just come back over to Sam. Yep.
Has the government had any discussions with the US about Kurt Campbell's visit to the Pacific this week? He said Islands and Fiji and I think one other country.
I personally haven't. I would need to check with the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Prime Minister as to whether they have. I mean, obviously the United States is an important global player and an important player in our region as well. And the Biden administration has been clear about their Indo-Pacific strategy that they want to pursue, so I'm not entirely surprised that they're here. We welcome their interest in the Pacific. This is a region that means a lot to New Zealanders, and I'm pleased to see them here.
Has Cabinet discussed or received any updated information on the situation with the draft security agreement between Solomon Islands and China?
Again, I haven't received an update on that. Obviously, we continue to maintain our position that that is a concerning development. That obviously Australia and New Zealand have a long history of working with the Solomon Islands, and we would rather that the solutions for them came from our region here in the Pacific, and we'll continue to take that stance, but I don't have an update on that position.
What do you imagine net migration will be this year and the next couple of years?
It's not a matter of my imagination. It's a matter of the forecasting, and we've seen from the Reserve Bank their forecasting, if I think I get the number right, around about a net positive migration of 24,000 by the end of next year. I certainly believe that plenty of people are going to want to come to New Zealand, but I'm also aware that some people will want to leave. To go off and do their OEs, to do the things that they haven't been able to do for the last couple of years. But we'll see. I'll just keep answering the question. We'll see where Treasury's forecasts get to in the budget as well, where you'll see that, and that's obviously the forecast that helps guide our decisions that we make. And so, we'll see where that gets. But certainly, the Reserve Bank thinks that we'll have net positive migration, and I would hope that would be the case.
Minister,
We'll just do then, and then we'll come back over here. We'll probably finish up over here.
Can I also ask whether you still have ambitions to be Prime Minister?
No. Next question. Gina. I said that in 2014.
Well, not audition, but fill in here.
I'm filling in.
Do you have a new variant of ambition, Grant?
No, the answer hasn't changed to the question.
People who are struggling to buy their the people who are struggling to buy their groceries at the supermarket, can they expect any help from you in this year's budget?
Well, I'm not going to preempt the budget decisions, obviously. We had the package on the 1st of April that gave a significant level of support to low and middle income earners. We've got the winter energy payment coming on the 1st of May, and we will always continue to look for ways that we can support people, but I'm not announcing the budget today. Bernard.
Minister, on the fall in house prices, which came out on Thursday, we're now down about 7 or 8% from the peak in November. Are you concerned that this fall in house prices could hurt household spending intentions or the economy more broadly?
Yeah, look, obviously there is a certain wealth effect that comes from people feeling that the value of their homes is increased, and that can from time to time flow through to other economic indicators. A lot of it depends on how far it falls, how sharp it falls. Bear in mind that even with those falls, as I'm sure you'd be quick to point out to me, we'll only be getting back to where we were a year or two ago, and so the fundamentals of the New Zealand economy remain strong. This is a country that has weathered the storm of COVID well. That's not just me saying that, that's what the IMF have told us, that's what the ratings agencies have told us. And so this is an economy where growth has been strong, dented somewhat by COVID, where unemployment is very low, where job prospects are good. And so I still think there's every reason to be optimistic about the New Zealand economy, albeit that we're going through a challenging period. And when it comes to the impact of house values on that, yes, there is evidence in the past that that's the case, but I'm not going to speculate on exactly where those prices will land. I'll just take you and Jenny and Thomas.
Just on as the economy is strong then, could it cope with significant further falls in house prices?
Again, I'm not here to speculate on particular house, and I haven't done that when house prices went up, and I won't do it when house prices go down. I believe that there is a resilience in the New Zealand economy that's got us through COVID, and I'm sure it'll get us through other economic challenges.
Larissa Wall, how can we be sure that she's the best person for the job when it comes to the Pacific Gender Equality Ambassador?
Oh, I think Lewis is a person who everybody has seen has prioritised human rights in her political career. She's a person who's championed the cause of women and LGBTQ communities, not just here in New Zealand, but also all around the world. So I think she's a person who's been appointed on her merits. Obviously, you'd need to talk to the Secretary of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Foreign Affairs about any concerns or ways that they might have thought about that, but she is somebody whose record stands for itself.
Yes, you'd expect maybe an ambassador role would come with some diplomatic skills as well. I mean, it was just a few days ago she was implying that the president of the Labour Party was corrupt.
Yeah, well, look, I think those comments that Lewis made are about the past, and she's looking to the future. And I think it's a role that she'll perform admirably on behalf of New Zealanders.
You've spent most of the press conference today talking about how many Kiwis are doing it tough, and here you've got the Labour Party creating an ambassador role for one of their mates.
Well, no, I think what's happened here is a role that's an important role. It's a role that exists in other jurisdictions. It's one that New Zealand's got an important role to play, and I think that Lewis will perform that role well. Thomas?
Another ambassador that throws around the word corrupt willy-nilly?
Well, I do know that Shane Jones got appointed as an ambassador by the previous national government, and he threw around a lot of words willy-nilly, to use your phrase, Gina. Thomas?
Just the Reserve Bank's language around inflation has changed, but initially everyone thought it would be a temporary spike, and now last week they said it was sustained. There were sustained inflation pressures. Are you doing any sort of policy work on what to do if the inflation is more sustained than we've thought in the past, and maybe in December and January next year we're dealing with the same sort of inflationary pressures that we are now?
Certainly keeping our eye on that. That's not the forecasts that we're getting, and that isn't, in fairness, the forecast that most economic commentators are giving. Clearly, Ukraine had a major impact on those who thought that this would be a first quarter phenomenon, and it's the reason why many people are now seeing it as more like a second quarter peak and then coming off then. But of course, we'll monitor that, and if things were to stay elevated for longer, that would influence both the monetary and fiscal policy, as we were discussing before.
Afford to continue. Michael Wood said last week that the policy advice on the fuel excise cut was suggested that it would be difficult to hike it in increments, and you could possibly have to put that Fed back on in one lot. Can the government continue to afford extending that if it needs to be extended?
Again, we said that we would review that decision before the end of the 3 months. We haven't done that review, and so I can't preempt that decision at this stage, nor whether it would be put on in one go or back on one go or in increments. We said we would look at where the global oil price was and the impact it was having on New Zealanders, and we'll do that when it comes time for the review. Last one.
And whether it's the future and how embedded it might be. There is a view that if we respond to climate change the way we need to, that is inherently going to see prices go up, because energy costs will go up. We'll need to price in climate risk in a way that we haven't done to date. So what do you think of that view, and do you think actually we could see higher prices looking ahead? Because
I think it's really important to see the kind of interventions that we make in response to climate change as long-term ones, and the kind of ideas around price increases are ones that are related to climate change, are ones that are spread out over a very long period of time. We have to deal with the here and now of this particular spike in inflation. Longer term, we have to work out ways of making sure that we again support New Zealanders through that transition to a low carbon economy. You've already seen some of the ways we've done that with things like the clean car discount and so on, and we intend to find other ways to make sure that we both make the transition but also make it an equitable one. And again, I'll have more to say about that at the budget. Thanks, everyone.
Oh.
Always a danger.